All right, y'all, we're back. I'm trying to make this larger. There we go. To read that last section of, again, this is History and Dispute, Volume 13, that I wanted to look into. Ooh, let me get this right. Hold on. Okay. And then I also wanted to look into another one. There are a lot of great sections in this portion, just presenting different viewpoints. And then we'll be done with this and moving on to back into the reading of that first resource mentioned in the introduction. Be sure to check out that playlist. It is the rooted text. And then also, we're going to be going more into the Botanical history, excuse me, and knowledge. All right. Did the slaves develop a new culture under slavery? All right, y'all needed to clear my throat. Okay. Viewpoint. Yes. Through a long, slow, uneven process, Africans transformed themselves into African Americans and created a distinctive culture that has an amalgam of African, European, and American customs. What are they? What? Okay. Beliefs and practices. They need to clear this up because I believe that they're using this term to describe natives. Excuse me. Yeah, anyway. Viewpoint. No. Forcibly detached from their homeland and kinship networks, set down in a strange environment, surrounded by an alien and hostile people, and herded together with other Africans with whom they had little or nothing in common, slaves had neither the means nor the opportunity to form a distinctive African American culture. This literally is goofy. And I'm not just saying that because I disagree with it. Y'all got to really understand what was just said here. All these statements about how they were stripped, about how everything they knew was gone, about how they were in proximity to people that they did not know or understand. And yet you're telling me that they didn't have an opportunity? Like, that's the argument? They didn't have an opportunity to form a distinctive culture? How does that make any sense in the world? If it is within our species' nature to develop behaviors, thought patterns, and processes, to develop comfort. And y'all forgive me, I don't know exactly what I'm trying to say here, but your argument is just on the basis of an opportunity. That's exactly when those things become forged, are in moments of trauma, unfortunately. Huh? Are in moments of displacement. Is how culture evolves throughout history. So I'm going to be interested to see what the heck they say to support this. Because what? Anywho, I haven't read this yet, y'all. So we'll be reading this for the first time together. The other ones I hadn't read through previously either. Some portions of it, but not completely. All right. So we're going to go into the overview and then we'll get into the different perspectives. The historical understanding of slave life and culture underwent many changes during the 20th century. The inability or unwillingness to take black people or black culture seriously marred the otherwise sophisticated and insightful analyses of historian Ulrich B. Phillips, who dominated the study of slavery during the first half of the 20th century. Phillips viewed blacks as naturally inferior, backward, and submissive. Even historians who shared neither Phillips' racial biases nor his benevolent view of slavery continued to emphasize the docility of the slaves. They were, according to Kenneth M. Stamp, in the peculiar institution, slavery in the antebellum South, a culturally rootless people. Ooh, wait. In Slavery, a Problem in American Institutional and Intellectual Life, Stanley M. Elkins characterized slaves as the helpless victims of a closed system and a total institution. The enslavement of Africans, Elkins suggested, had much in common with the experience of Jews in Nazi concentration camps during the Holocaust. Robbed of their African culture and prevented from creating a meaningful alternative, slaves became infantile, Sambos, oh Lord, who identified completely with white norms, values, and standards, and who, as a consequence, had no independent life of their own. What a goofy thing to say. When we've set the standard, mofo. What? Huh? Huh? Ugh. All right. The so-called Elkins thesis provoked stinging retorts. I bet, because how bold of you. Ugh. All right. Scholars countered that Elkins had accumulated little. I'm like, what in the world? Empirical evidence to support his conclusions. They found, on the contrary, that slaves had established a vibrant culture that rules the world, mind you. Anyway, that enabled them to sustain their psychic independence and emotional equilibrium, and thereby to resist oppression and exploitation. Our very existence is resistance. To rebuke Elkins' contention that slaves were passive, tractable, and obedient, historians writing in the 1960s and 1970s began to focus on the slaves themselves rather than on the treatment that they had received from whites. In the work of Eugene Genovese, Robert Fogel, Stanley Ingerman, Herbert Gutman, John Blassingame, Lawrence Levine, and a host of others, slaves for the first time became historical actors in their own drama. No longer were they the mere objects of either white brutality or white affection. The world the slaves made became a viable subject for historical investigation. We've always been the main characters. What? The achievements of this generation of historians fundamentally altered the understanding of slave life and culture. Instead of portraying the slaves as victims, these people emphasized their resilience, ingenuity, and autonomy, perhaps in their urgency to demonstrate that the slaves were not the casualties of their masters' despotism. These historians overstated the case for slave independence. Younger scholars have already begun to challenge the judgment that slaves managed somehow to escape the worst ravages of slavery. Nevertheless, the effort to rebuke Elkins made it forever impossible to imagine the slaves as utterly bereft of identity and culture and totally subject to and dependent upon the will of the master. Yeah, because what he's doing is reducing them to lesser creatures, lesser animals than who and what they are, which is in line with supporting the bull crap that has fueled the system in the first place. Shame on him. Yes, we're going to read this again. Through a long, slow, uneven process, Africans transformed themselves into African Americans and created a distinctive culture that was an amalgam of African, European, and American customs, belief, and practices. And I think it's important in any of these dispute conversations to not so much center Africans, but also the Black natives, which were a huge percentage for many of us, not all of us, who were also a part of the ethnogenesis and amalgamation to create a distinctive culture and almost a different people as a result of this experience. So it wasn't just the Africans that came over, but also those Black natives here that transformed themselves, and even some of the red natives that would, mix with and join with those there in that time. So when the first African slaves arrived in North America more than 4 centuries ago, they brought little with them, stripped of earthly possessions, and in many cases, even of their names. They had only their memories and cultural traditions to sustain them. Y'all forgive me. I need to make my herbal teas. I gotta brush my teeth, wash my face, do what I need to do before jumping into this, because I'm hyper focused on this right now. But There's snow outside. Okay, it's snow. All right, the weather changed. I'm congested because of the drop in barometric pressure where I'm at and the temperature. Okay, and also I did bake yesterday too, and so yeah, it's just a combination of things working together. Okay, so forgive me, y'all, for sounding so congested. All right, where was I? I'm sorry, being goofy and then lost my place. All right. In time, these bits and pieces of cultural inheritance, drawn from many different sources, came together to create a new and vibrant cultural force throughout the Americas. And it's not one monolithic cultural force, because in the Americas alone, you have different places, different influences, different experiences. Okay? This culture has endured and flourished with little sign of disappearing. Indeed, indeed. For decades, historians have fiercely debated the notion that African American slaves developed their own culture. Earlier generations of scholars flatly denied that an African American slave culture existed. One of the strongest arguments came from Melvin J. Herkovitz. All right, y'all, forgive me. I had to make me a cup of tea. I don't know if you guys know when I'm pausing this and like if it's putting space in between when it picks back up, you know? I'm gonna have to go through and rewatch a lot of these videos. All right, sipping on some lemon ginger echinacea, purpurea to be specific, because there are numerous species of echinacea. With a little bit of green tea mixed in. I believe this is the sinensis species. And I put in a little bit of honey mixed with royal jelly, which is really, really great. So, one moment. That's what I'm sipping on. All right. Let's delve back into this. Okay. So, Herkovitz argued that a people without a past had no reliable connections to their history, which some historians of slavery in the South took as proof of the absence of slave culture. Further, these scholars also believe that any people without a history were, according to Michael Block, and by the work of their hands, studies in African American folk life, more easily looked upon as a commodity or tools, suggesting that the slaveholders' collective conscience was somewhat comforted by the idea that the slaves were little more than blank tablets to be inscribed as they saw fit. The belief among slaveholders that slaves were a people without a culture and a history thus made them easier to abuse and exploit. This pattern continued well into the 20th century. The publication of sociologist, I don't know why that just got me hemmed up, y'all, E. Franklin Frazier's groundbreaking Negro Family in the United States seemed to confirm the prevailing conceptions about the cultural and historical background in which blacks lived. Frazier argued that African American family life was more the product of white domination than of any historical tradition that existed among the slaves or their ancestors. To suggest, however, that slaves preserved nothing of their African heritage and developed no culture of their own in the New World is to do blacks a grave disservice. Even under the rigors of slavery, blacks forged a culture from disparate elements that offered them both a measure of solace and autonomy. Again, they're not, for some reason, including, the black natives. Herkovitz was among the first scholars to identify the presence of what he termed Africanisms, or elements of African origin and influence present African American culture. Although many scholars initially dismissed Herkovitz's theories, they rushed to judgment. Herkovitz's initial findings helped lay the groundwork for future research that examined more closely the traits and materials from which African American culture derived. Still, Herkovitz wrote disparagingly about the possibility that any African customs, beliefs, and practices had survived the journey from Africa intact. It is apparent that African forms, had but a relatively slight chance of survival. Utensils, clothing, food were supplied to slaves by their masters. Thus, African draped cloths were placed by tailored clothing, however ragged. The short-handled, broad-bladed hoe gave way to the long-handled, slimmer-bladed implement of Europe, and such techniques as weaving and ironworking and wood carving were almost entirely lost. In his introduction to By the Work of Their Hands, Vlok has gone beyond Herkovitz's initial conclusions to show that Africanisms were not, in fact, an isolated cultural element, but an assertive proof of an alternative history that provides a link to an unwritten past. Anthropologist Paul Bohannon gives further credence to this idea, particularly in reference to African American cultural expressions such as folktales. He states that all elements present in any culture are determined twice, once in reality and once in the mind. Thus, an African American folktale has two purposes. First, it is a form of entertainment and perhaps, Lord. Hold on, y'all. Let me sip some tea. Woo-wee. As y'all can tell, my mind is still waking up. Y'all forgive me. Perhaps of instruction. Second, it is a cultural artifact that keeps alive customs, practices, beliefs, and memories. Given this broadened description of what constitutes culture, historians, anthropologists, and archaeologists can use virtually any artifact, from pottery to utensils, from stories to songs, and even a particular architectural style, to indicate the existence of an African American culture. In its origins and evolution, African American culture responded to two different sources: Africa and Europe. What? Again, just completely negating the Black native influence. I don't even want to finish reading this because it's pissing me off. It's pissed me off. Because what in the real, what are they talking about? What is they talking about? Y'all? Lord have mercy. And to go even beyond that, I'd argue, okay, that not only did they pull in, sure, certain elements, disjointed elements of previous cultures that they were a part of, to some degree, more of which came from this land, but they also remembered their historical and biblical ties. Argue with your mama, okay? There we wept. Something, something Babylon. When we hanged our hearts upon the willows. Listen. I believe that. I really do. Memory like that is etched in the heart and in the mind. That don't go nowhere. Even scripture even scripture itself said that the Father would write his laws upon our hearts. You know what I'm saying? So it runs through our veins. It is in our very blood. And it can morph and transform into many things. But yeah, it wasn't just two different sources. Okay? Anyway, although some scholars have maintained that any group coming to America drew on similar sources, African Americans have a special history. You darn right we do. They were, and that ain't even the right way to define who we is. Foundational Black American, thank you very much. They were the only people systemically brought to the New World against their will and forcibly placed in servitude. Because of this circumstance, it is not too much to say that foundational Black Americans, in a sense, had European culture forced upon them and that they were expected to conform to it. Yet, despite the shock of capture, the ordeal of the Middle Passage, the hardship of slavery, and the coerced cultural immersion that they endured, foundational Black Americans managed to retain important elements of the African past in however fragmentary a way. This situation prompted among foundational Black Americans the development of another important and enduring aspect of their culture and personality: improvisation. The ongoing creativity of an enslaved and downtrodden people who, from a position of weakness and vulnerability, sought to make the most of what they kept. African American scholar and essayist Cornel West has recognized in this tendency toward improvisation one of the defining qualities of what he describes as the cultural hybrid character of foundational Black American life. To explain this distinctive outlook, West turned to the metaphor of jazz, not so much, as he wrote, as a term for a musical art form, as for a mode of being in the world, an improvisational mode of protean, fluid, flexible disposition toward reality, suspicious of either or viewpoints, dogmatic pronouncements, or supremacist ideologies, the interplay of individuality and unity in one of the uniformity and unanimity. I'm getting it. Relaxed. Unanimity imposed. What? Right? Unanimous is this what this is from, but it's like from above, but rather of conflicts among diverse groupings that reach a dynamic you know what? Y'all, I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna go ahead and end this because clearly I might have to re-record this because we're struggling today. What's going on? I don't understand. Lord help me. All right, let me end this.